Vyos is a virtual router which installs on most hypervisors, VMware, KVM, and also the open source XCP-NG, which is the Zen server clone. The purpose of the Vyos router is to let you route traffic between different VLANs that you may have for your virtual machines. I'm going to walk through the steps of installing the virtual router. Okay, so if we go over to Vyos.io, they give you a lot of information about Vyos, what it is, and how it works. They have options where you can purchase the LTS version, and you purchase a subscription, and that will give you access to technical support and also access to upgrades. They also give you links for the actual source code. So if you wanted, you could download and build your own source code. The problem there is you don't get any support. So you'd have to get a subscription if you want some type of support. They also have what is called a rolling release, which means they build Vyos every night and they make it available for anyone to download. The issue there again is you don't get any support. So I've been using this rolling release for about 2 years now. I had one in 2019, and it's now time to update that. But before we start, you look at the supported platforms. You see that here. It supports Hyper-V, KVM, which runs on almost every version of Linux. And also down at the bottom down here, where'd it go? Down at the bottom, it supports the XCP-NG, which is the open source version of the Zen server hypervisor. Now, before I start, I want to show you what I have here as far as network. I have a 24-port unified switch, and on that switch I have defined several VLANs. These VLANs are just randomly chosen by me, and I assign them to different subnets. None of the VLANs are special. Only VLAN 35 here. VLAN 35 is used specifically for backups from the VMs to my QNAP NAS. So when you look at my QNAP NAS, it has 2 ports on the back of it, and those 2 ports are chunked together, and all of those VLANs can pass across that trunk. But I'm only passing VLAN 35 traffic right now, and so it's a virtual switch that will allow me to pass the traffic. I also have a VMware ESXi server. That is the free version of VMware. It limits you to what you can do, but it's useful for what I want to do with it. I just have very basic virtual machines, so I don't need the options like vCenter and all that other stuff. While we're waiting for that to load, I will switch over to, I also have the XCP-NG server, which is the Zen server. And that has multiple NICs on it here. What was that page over here? And each of my servers, I have one of these network cards. It is a, let's see here. It is a GTEC 1.25 gigabit card, and it's got 4 ports on it. So when you look at my XCP server, those 4 ports show up as individual NICs. So you see 0, 1, 2, and 3 are all Intel corporations. They're all on that one card. And then the NIC 4 is the built-in Ethernet interface, which is a Realtek. So I've taken those 4 ports and I've bonded them together. And then within that bond, I have defined those same VLANs. So these VLANs are available to talk on that switch. Now, if the VMware ever came up, which it did not, I may have to hit reload there. The VMware server also has one of those 4-port NICs in it. Well, the physical NICs are here. So you got 0 through 3 again. That's the 4-port NIC. And then you've got 1, which is the built-in. And VMware uses port groups to define the actual VLANs. So these are the port groups, and these are the VLANs that they're associated with. And we also have on my main machine, I have that same card. It's got 4 ports on it, which are these 4 wired connections. And then it has ETH4, which is the built-in. Those 4 ports are combined into a bonded interface, which is then trunked up to that same switch. And then I've defined VLANs on that bonded interface. So each hypervisor, the KVM, the VMware, and the XCP all have bonded interfaces with the VLANs so they can all talk to each other. Now, well, the reason we're putting in the Vyos router is because if we have something on VLAN 30 and it wants to talk to VLAN 25, something on VLAN 25, it's going to use this Vyos router to make that communication. To start the actual install of Vyos, we need to go back over to the Vyos site. I'll get rid of that extra window. From their main page at the bottom of the screen, there's some links there. One of the links is for documentation. Hit that link and go look at the installation. And it gives you a description of what's available. They have nightly builds that they do every night, nightly betas, and they have snapshots. If you have a subscription with them, you can download the latest, well, the current version, and you also get support for that. They give you information on building from source. You can also click this link for the rolling release, which is what I'll get. That takes you to a site, and you can hit current, AMD, and you click the latest version, and it downloads an ISO file. You take that ISO file and you install it on your hypervisor. Now, I already have a Vyos router here, so I'm going to shut that one down. That's running an older version. Let me make this larger, sorry. Failed to says you must be root. Have to run sudo. Okay, so I've shut down the existing Vyos router, and I'm going to create a new one and install from that ISO. And Vyos is based on Debian, so I just select the latest release of Debian that's listed in my hypervisor. I'm going to call this Vyos 2021. Give it a description there. And it wants to know where I want to install. I'm going to select the ISO that I downloaded, which is called BIOS Rolling Latest. And I'll hit next. Want to put it on this server. It only needs one CPU. Playing around with the previous version, I found that 4 gigs was enough to make it transfer at acceptable speeds. I did test with 1, 2, 4, 8, and 16 gigs, and the sweet spot appeared to be the 4 gigs, so I just used 4 gigs here. And it asks what size partition. 10 gigs is more than enough, so I'll leave it there. Now here's the important part. It defaults to network 4. In my case, network 4 is the outside interface, which connects to my inside home network. So I want that to be my Ethernet 0. But you also need an interface for the internal network. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add, and I want to add from that bonded network. When I add from that bonded network, that's going to let me add one interface, but then I can add sub interfaces underneath that. So I tell it to add from that bonded interface, and I hit next. And it's going to start it automatically. It just gives me a summary here, and I hit create now. You see down at the bottom, it's provisioning and creating the disk. And it shows up here, but it's not done yet. So I can click it, I can hit the console. And when you hit the console, it starts up and it wants to boot into a live CD. So there's no option around that. You have to go ahead and let it boot into the live CD. Go ahead and let it boot. It should come up and give you a login prompt. And once you get to the login, the default login is Vyos, and the default password is Vyos. So once it's booted, I want to look at the interfaces that are there. What we got here? We got our loop back. We've got an Ethernet 0 interface, and we've got an Ethernet 1 interface. And remember, we're going to put sub interfaces on Ethernet 1 because we use that bonded interface. So to start the actual install, you have to type install image. No, it's just install image without the sudo. Okay, Vyos install local hard drive. Yes is the default, so I hit enter. And let it go ahead and auto select unless you know what you're doing. I don't, so I just let it auto select. And it's defaulting to the default 10 gig drive. Tells me it's going to destroy the data. You have to type yes there. how big of a root partition, the whole thing. So hit enter. And then it goes through and it creates the file system and it copies all the needed files there. Now, when you install it, it asks you for the name of the image. I leave it at the default. You could make that a name that may mean something to you, but I leave it as default and go ahead and install it. It's asking where it wants to put the configuration files, and I'll just accept the default and hit enter. It wants to change the default password for the Vyos account. So I'll give it a password. Retype it. And it's going to install Grub, so hit enter. You're telling it says I'm installing on a Zen server. Would you like to set up the config to prepare for conversion? And I'll say no there because I don't know what that means. It says done, so I will hit reboot. Are you sure you want to reboot? No, yes. Starts booting. I get my Grub screen there. And while that's booting, we'll go back to our documentation link. Under the user guide, there's an option here for configuration mode in the quick start. Talks about setting up the interfaces in SSH and also DHCP. I'm going to do a basic installation because all this thing does for me is it routes traffic from one subnet to the other. And these are the types of commands that you have to issue. And they have all types of documentation here that you can follow. So we're going to get to this Vyos login page. We're going to go in this Vyos and we change the password. Okay, so we booted and we have no config. Okay, the first thing I want to do is I want to put an IP on that external interface so that I can set this up over SSH. So I do a config T, not config T, that's Cisco. I do a config. And you notice the prompt has changed to a £. That means you're in configuration mode. So what I want to do is put an IP address on interface ETH0. And I've already got it copied, but I can't paste in this window, so I'm going to have to type it. Zero address. And if you want to SSH to the box, you have to put some type of SSH configuration in it. And while I'm doing that, I can show you that if you start typing a command and you type a question mark, it'll show you all the options that are available there. So I know that I'm going to type something for SSH and it's a service. So I type service, then a question mark. The one I want is SSH. I can just keep typing question marks. So you have to set up at least one of these options so that SSH will be enabled. The easiest one to do is the port, which is normally 22. So all I've done is put an IP on this, and I put a, I've turned on the SSH, but we also want to put in the default route. So we have to set protocols, And if I do a question mark, it just walks me through it. It gives me the options. It's kind of like a Cisco router. But I know what I want to type here. I want to type static route 0.0.0.0/0 12.168.99. Now that is another router. That's actually an Edge Router X that sits on my network. So I've got the Vyos router, which is a virtual router, and its default router is my physical Edge Router X, which would then give me access to the internet. So once you've made those changes, you have to commit them. And it tells you to do a commit. The commit makes the changes. You have to type save so that it writes the changes out to your config.boot. So I would do a commit here. And then I would do a save. Now, if I didn't do a save, I would exit. And it tells me the changes haven't been saved. That means if I reboot the virtual router for some reason, it won't have those settings there because I didn't save them. So I'll go back to config and I'll save. And it says it's saved. So let's go and see if we can get to it here. Got to get out of this screen. I'll clear that. So I want to see if I can ping. I'm at 3.168.9.11. And I can ping it, so it's reachable. Now it may complain about the SSH key changing. Let me try that here. Why is it 192.168.9? Yeah, see, it's complaining because the original Vyos router had a set of SSH keys and my system knows about it. So I got to get rid of the original SSH keys, and it tells you how to do that by typing this. So then when I go back and I SSH to it, it prompts me for a password. Here I am at my Vyos screen, and I'm ready to do my initial installation. Now to do the actual configuration, I need to assign IP addresses to the interfaces on the router. Now Vyos uses a command called a VIF, which is a virtual interface, to represent the sub interfaces that are going to be on that bonded interface. So I've got that bonded interface that's got 4 ports on it, and I'm going to set up VLAN 90 here, VLAN 20, 25, and so on. And each one has its own IP address. And those interfaces also have a IP version 6 address. So once I get all the IP addresses configured, I'm also going to add a DHCP server for my actual virtual machine networks. That way, when I'm building a VM, I can just pop it in, let it do DHCP and boot up, and I can change it to static later. And again, all of this information is on their documentation page. They show you here how to set up DHCP. If you want to use the Vyos router to forward DNS queries, you can point your VM machines to the Vyos router and it would do DNS for you for that. In my case, I don't need NAT, but it gives examples on how to use NAT. It's also a firewall, so you can do firewalls. So you want to read through all this documentation, and it'll give you information on how to get things set up. So what we're going to do is we're going to enter configure mode. And I'm going to pop my notes over here. I'll leave this on top. Now I've already put in the IP and the gateway. So I want to put the sub interfaces in and put IP addresses on them. And just to show you again, if you start typing commands, eth1, if I put a question mark there, it'll give me all the options there. And the option I'm going to put in is a VIF, which is a VLAN, basically a virtual local area network ID. But to save time, I'm going to paste this in. Take that and copy it. Come over here and paste it. The same with the version 6 addresses. Now I don't need a version 6 address on VLAN 40 because I use that for something else. I'm going to paste in the version 6 IP addresses. Copy there and paste it there. I also have an open VPN server running back on a Raspberry Pi, and that's the subnet that it uses. I also have a gateway going out to, what's that going out to? I have a gateway going out to a free PBX server that's out in the cloud, and I route that through the VPN server over a different open VPN connection. But I need to tell this Vyos router how to get there, and this is how I do that. I route the traffic for those two networks back to this IP, which is a Raspberry Pi. All right, I also want to set my default route for IP version 6. Normally you don't have to do that. IP version 6 will pick up the default route from your gateway router, but I like to put it in myself. So I'll pop that in. Okay, so I've got all that in and I need to save that, so I hit commit. And I hit save. All right, Alma Linux, are you still there? You are still there. That's because you are not. If I come back over here, this is one of my VMs, DNS1. Let's see where that is. That VM is here, and it is on VLAN 30 by default. Okay, I also have another VM called Mirror. This is my the VM that mirrors the Alma Linux repositories, and it is on VLAN 25. So when I look at the DNS1, I can see that it's on 30.21. When I look at the mirror, that disconnected me because I changed that. So we have to go back. So on the mirror site, the mirror VM, I should say, it's on VLAN 25. Now, if I look at the routes on this VM, you can see my default route is 25.15, which is the Vyos router that I just set up. And if I do the same thing on DNS1, which is on a different VLAN, so it's IP route show. My default route is 30.15. Now, most times the default route usually ends in .1, but I'm using .15 because I know that .15 represents my BIOS router. I do a lot of testing and stuff. So in my lab, I have a pfSense appliance, and it listens on .14 for each one of the subnets. So I can switch them out and do testing as I want. So this one's gateway is pointing to 30.15. And back there, and I do a show config. All right, when I do show config, my outside interface, which is on my internal network, is 99.11. So if I have anything on my internal network that I want to get to these VLANs that are back on my virtual network, I have to route them through this 99.11. But if you can see, this virtual interface on VLAN 20 is .15 here, .15. So just a simple test. What's the mirror IP? The mirror IP is 25.88. So if I'm on DNS1, which is on the 30 VLAN, I go to ping 25.88, it can ping it. That lets me know that my basic routing is working correctly. I do a trace route. If trace route is on this box, you can see it trace routes and it goes to the Vyos box and hits 25.88. Now on 25.88, which is the mirror box, there's a firewall that's not letting trace route come through. That's what the exclamation X is about. But you get the point. Pings are allowed with trace routers now. Also, you can see now that I have routing between the VLANs, I can also route out to the internet. Because remember, my default gateway points to my edge router, so the traffic will go there. And this is from a VM that's running on a hypervisor that's running through the Vyos virtual router. So you can see a trace route will go to my Vyos router, to my edge router, which is the physical device, and that goes out to the internet. So everything appears to be working the way it should. So this is a very basic configuration for a Vyos router. I put interfaces on the router, and then I put sub interfaces on that bonded interface that will let me route all my virtual networks in my environment. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe.